Responding to Jesus' Mythicism. In this first part, let us look into the problem and understand the opponent's arguments for Jesus' mythicism, including the 4 pillars of Jesus' mythicism. In the second part, the Christian response to Jesus' mythicism will be explored. Skeptics have questioned Jesus' existence as a real historical figure. This is known as Jesus' mythicism. Jesus' mythicism is the belief that Jesus Christ was not a real person, but rather a mythical figure. Proponents of this theory claim that there is no evidence that Jesus Christ ever existed, and that the stories about him were created by early Christians to promote their religion. Those who believe in Jesus' mythicism typically point to the lack of contemporary accounts of Jesus Christ, as well as the inconsistencies in the biblical stories about him. They argue that it is more likely that Jesus was based on earlier pagan myths than that he was a real historical figure. Jesus' mythicism has been around since the 18th century, but has gained traction in recent years thanks to the internet. It is a controversial topic, and there are many people who disagree with its tenets. While there are some questionable mythicist ideas floating around the internet, there are also many credible scholars who present a compelling case for mythicism. In recent years, a number of in-depth, well-researched articles advocating for mythicism have been released. On the Historicity of Jesus, Why We Might Have Reason to Doubt by Richard Carrier, Jesus, Mything in Action by David Fitzgerald, and the Christ Myth Theory and Its Problems by Robert M. Price are among them. The number of respectable scholars publicly questioning Jesus' historicity has risen dramatically in the recent decade. According to Craig Evans, the main mythicist arguments are summarized by 2 claims. 1. The evidence for Jesus' existence is weak and unimpressive, and 2. There is good reason to believe that the stories of Jesus presented in the New Testament Gospels are constructs inspired by various pagan mythologies, particularly those involving dying and rising gods. According to Dr. Jeff Magruder's 4 pillars describe Jesus' mythicism. The first pillar is that the Gospels are not eyewitness reports. That is, they were written far later than the events they pretend to recount, and they are dense with legend and myth. Second, the epistles make no reference of the historical Jesus. According to the reasoning, the epistles are about a celestial entity, a Jesus who lives in the divine world rather than someone who lived on earth. Third, secular sources make no reference of a miracle-working Jesus. Fourth, the epistles teach about a non-historical, heavenly Jesus. In this second part, let us explore the Christian responses to Jesus' mythicism. Unlike many myths, the life of Jesus has been marked by several indicators that testify to historicity. In his work, Paul, the Traveler and Roman Citizen, William Ramsey concludes that Luke, the author of the 3rd Gospel of Jesus Christ, is a first-rate historian. Why would a non-believer come to such a conclusion and become a Christian unless the Book of Acts has sufficient proof to call it history? According to the Cambridge Companion to the Gospels are a combination of Greco-Roman biographies and Jewish history, with John the Baptist continuing after the divine quiet following the prophet Malachi in the Old Testament. This is compatible with Mark's Gospel's literary style, which is most closely related to the genre of biography, a type of Greco-Roman literature that arose from the discipline of history when specific people became the center of research and writing. Biographies, like historiography, began in nearly chronological order, as is the case with Mark. This is not to claim that Mark's writing endeavors were affected only by contemporaneous Greco-Roman literature. A thorough understanding of the work's nature must acknowledge the significant impact of the Old Testament and later Jewish history, not least in their common endeavor to reflect the outworking of the divine intent in historical accounts. Even if no Old Testament books have the appearance of the Gospel of Mark, elements of some of them, such as the Abraham or the Elijah story, are intriguing antecedents, highlighting Mark's apparent debt to Old Testament religion. When we refer to Mark as a biography, we should keep in mind that Mark's book is not an analogy of the biographies with which we are most familiar today. Psychological reasons, early influences, physical appearance, birth date, these and other variables factor heavily in our expectations of current biography but play little or no part in the Greco-Roman world. A biography in antiquity detailed the significance of a renowned person's career, seldom focused on his infancy but frequently incorporating mention of how he died, since how a person died was seen as a measure of his character. Furthermore, famous people gained their reputation not so much by their uniqueness, their sticking out from the crowd, because the contemporary, Western idea of individuality had limited place in Roman antiquity, where people's identities and importance were decided by their communities of reference. Thus, a person may be featured in a biography because he demonstrated the traits that society values. One justification for considering the Gospel of Mark to have been written primarily for Christian communities rather than as an evangelistic tool for non-Christians is the extent to which it believes its readers will have admired and began to follow the unusual principles taught and practiced by Jesus. Luke, ch. 3:1-2, explains the historical political environment in which Jesus lived and died. According to Paul, Acts 26 verse 26, the events of Jesus' life and resurrection did not take place in a dark alley. According to John, 1 John 1, Jesus was a genuine person who they saw, heard, and touched. Peter, 2 Peter 1 verse 16, claims that what he has been told is not a fable, but rather an eyewitness account of Jesus. Papias, Polycarp, Ignatius, and Clement were disciples of the Apostle John who referenced the New Testament and whose existence and labor confirmed the apostles and their teacher Jesus. In other words, there was no Jesus, no apostles, and no disciples of the apostles. The majority of the New Testament is included in the quotations by these early church fathers. These early church fathers, according to Warner J. Wallace, sat at the feet of the apostles and learnt through apostolic eyewitness. These secondary leaders then composed letters of their own, reiterating their teachers' assertions and that the early church fathers did, in fact, cite the text as it had been handed down to them. What did they have to say about Jesus? The Old Testament predicted Jesus, as described in the New Testament. According to the New Testament, Jesus is divine. As described in the New Testament, Jesus taught his disciples. According to the New Testament, Jesus performed miracles. According to the New Testament, Jesus was born of a virgin. Jesus lived, ministered, died, and was crucified. Thus the disciples of the early apostles confirm the apostolic teaching. The passing on of information from one generation to another through a system of discipleship can be claimed to be a chain of custody. The similar example would be the teachings of karate or kung fu, which are passed on from one generation to another. These are passed on from one generation to another through persons who obtain expertise by obtaining black belt and then becoming teachers themselves. Thus, the chain of custody helps to maintain the teachings from one generation to another. Furthermore, Jewish Roman historians Flavius Josephus, Pliny the Younger, Lucian, Suetonius, and Tacitus the Roman historian have written about Jesus and his followers, the Church. The amount of material provided by the New Testament texts is unsurpassed in history, as is the closeness of the writings to the actual events. The life of Jesus and the biographies of Jesus were just a generation away. When the Gospels were written, the eyewitnesses were still alive. The texts also claim to be eyewitness experiences rather than myths. Nobody disputes that the period between the Gallic Wars and the first extant copies is at least 1,000 years. If someone thinks the Gallic Wars occurred, he cannot contradict the Gospel narratives. In this third part of responding to Jesus' mythicism, let us uncover the philosophical underpinnings of Jesus' mythicism. Modern doubt regarding Jesus and his historicity is new, and it is based on skepticism and unbalanced historical interpretation to promote their philosophical standpoint of atheism. They lack credibility and spread unsubstantiated anti-Christian bigotry. The secular New Testament study unequivocally affirms the biblical figure of Jesus as a historical person. Many times, rejection of the resurrection/miracles is owing to liberal bias against the supernatural, i.e., anti-supernatural bias. A philosophically biased examination of Jesus' life is not true to the evidence at hand, and it is not the correct method to approach any subject, i.e., in a biased manner. It is entirely consistent for resurrection to be God's most conspicuous act in proving and attesting to the legitimacy of his earthly incarnation. Even the rationalistic, anti-supernaturalist assumptions that often underlie the identification of legendary material can have a positive role, compelling us to ask how far the theological point of the story in question is really dependent on the factual occurrence of the event it ostensibly narrates. It enables us to see that the truth of the story is to be sought somewhere in the relationship between Jesus, God, and the world, in the broad space opened up by Christian faith rather than in the cramped space of factual occurrence or non-occurrence. If historical research regards this material as untruthful and labeling it as unhistorical, then Christian faith can only reject this conclusion. Yet it is a positive theological gain to recognize that the relationship between story and reality may be more or less direct or indirect, and that the nature of the reality in question requires this complex mode of narration. The Cambridge Companion to Jesus. What is the nature of the reality in question? In a theistic cosmos, resurrection is crucial as an act of God's vindication, the miracle that tops off all the other miracles in Jesus' life. Only in an atheistic, materialistic, naturalistic cosmos are miracles an issue. Miracles do occur in a supernatural realm, at the discretion of the supernatural agent. Finally, whether people choose to embrace it or not, the New Testament document presents a supernatural worldview that should be analyzed as such. The only reason people refuse to embrace miracles is because of their atheistic, materialistic, naturalistic, anti-supernatural prejudice. However, an honest historical investigation cannot produce accurate results if it is skewed in favor of the inquirer's bias. The only reason secular scholarship cannot accept the Gospels is an a priori objection due to philosophical assumptions that contradicts the Gospel. What is a priori? Prior to. Consider the following proposition: if George V reigned for at least 4 days, he ruled for more than 3 days. This is something that one knows from the start since it conveys a proposition that one can deduce from logic alone. What is a posteriori? After the fact, contrast the preceding claim with the proposition stated by the sentence, George V ruled from 1910 until 1936. This is something that, if true, one must learn after the fact because it conveys an empirical reality that is unknowable by reason alone. Facts can only be known after they have occurred. Events like miracles cannot be ruled out a priori. The flaw that makes secular historians what they are is their a priorist approach fueled by the philosophy of skepticism.